Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for stopping by again. Look, today I'm sharing a podcast episode I recorded recently with Rob Russo at 49th Parahell. Rob is a fantastic podcaster. He's a great Twitter user, super funny, super insightful, just a great guy. I had a super fun time recording this podcast episode with him, and it's going to play after this clip. In this episode, we talked about the NDP, some of the history, where they've gone right in the last couple months, where they've struggled in the last couple years, and how it's maybe all coming together right now under a really strong campaign by Jagmeet Singh. So if you're interested in that, stick around after this clip. It's just going to play on a static background because it was an audio-only podcast, but I hope you guys enjoy it. Please visit Rob Russo on Twitter. Please visit Rob Russo's podcast. Both of those links will be in the description. Let him know that I sent you, and I hope you enjoy this. If you like my stuff, you'll likely at least like some of Rob's stuff, so do check him out. Thanks, guys. I hope you enjoy this. Okay.
Christo Ivalis, very pleased to have you on the program today to get into some of this electoral NDP stuff. I appreciate you coming on. How's it going? How's it going over there?
Great. Thanks for having me. Great to be on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to it. I've spent a lot of time talking about the election and complaining about the various parties involved. But I am interested to get your perspective on some of this stuff as someone who does focus more specifically on the NDP and get more into the specifics about what's been going on with them. Actually, before we get started, you just kind of want to introduce yourself and just explain how you're how you're connected to the NDP and some of the work that you do.
Yeah, for sure. Well, my academic title is I'm a postdoctoral fellow in history at the at University of Toronto. I also have a YouTube channel where I talk about Canadian politics mostly, other issues as well, but mostly Canadian politics from a democratic socialist perspective. And I am a member of the NDP. Have a role in the riding association at my local level here in Kingston, Ontario. So I kind of bring that perspective, which is partisan in a sense, but openly so. So I'm glad to kind of have a chat, bringing in some history, bringing in some contemporary stuff about the NDP.
Great. Yeah, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? I mean, we're so close to the United States, and obviously that the U.S. has such gravity when it comes to the sort of the political shenanigans that are constantly going on there. And it seems like a lot of stuff about Canadian politics really slide under the radar. Not a lot of people pay attention to what's happening here. And in fact, I think a lot of people in the US and elsewhere, and even in Canada, have kind of a distorted idea of what our politics are all about, because of our proximity to the US partially. And it's kind of interesting because in this election, all of a sudden there's all these eyeballs on Canada that really aren't really there usually.
Yeah, I mean, Canadians pay attention to U.S. politics ubiquitously. It's always, and part of that's because the U.S. system's in perpetual election mode with the 2-year cycles in the Congress and Senate elections every 2 years, presidential elections every 4, meaning that every 2 years there's big elections every November. But it's just the fact that the American media landscape is so penetrative into Canada, and the reverse just isn't true. I mean, in the last few years, you've been seeing more American interest into Canadian media, and Canadian stories and Canadian politics, but that's primarily marketed to Canadians. That's the Washington Post, and that's the New York Times trying to get Canadian subscribers and Canadian clicks, so they're covering Canadian content. It's not as much for Americans, but during elections, it does seem like, people are really interested to find out what's happening. There's celebrity interest from, we'll talk a bit about that, but there's celebrity interest in the election. American sources like, the Patriot Act with Hassan Minhaj had Justin Trudeau on and kind of did a Canadian election special. John Oliver in 2015 at least did one as well. And so it's a rare moment where the world cares about us beyond, here's what Justin Trudeau, supposedly said to Trump or didn't say to Trump or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, that's been kind of an interesting thing, too, because Trudeau has this very carefully curated kind of image that's been portrayed, very effectively, I think, in American media. So I think a lot of Americans had a very distorted idea of what our political system was about and what Justin Trudeau was about. And that's really been punctured by some of his recent scandals, shall we say, that have made a lot of headlines there. And all of a sudden people are saying, like, wait a second, I thought, this totally runs contrary to what my opinions were about what this guy was about and what Canada is about.
No, I think that's a big factor. I mean, I think, a lot of us on the left, we sort of knew Justin Trudeau was lying to Canadians in 2015. We knew electoral reform was a lie. We knew many of his promises to Indigenous people were lies. We knew that, right at the beginning of his government, they were already talking about, young people embracing the job churn and like on and on and on. It was pretty evident. But for a lot of Canadians who aren't, directly plugged into politics, and especially for world observers, Justin Trudeau was this progressive breath of fresh air in relation both to Stephen Harper, who preceded him, but also, Donald Trump, of course. And as we've seen, with the Brexit, movement in Britain, Trudeau has been seen relative to other Anglosphere leaders, with the exception of maybe, Jacinda Ardern, as like the progressive voice. And I think that in recent months, the scandals have hit not so much on technical issues on the global sense, but as a complication of Trudeau's image. And I think that's what's been more damaging. The SNC corruption is good old-fashioned Canadian crony capitalism. And of course, all capitalism is crony capitalism. But, the reality is that, Canadian governments intertwining themselves with big corporations is literally how this country was founded in some ways. And so that's not a surprise, at all. But what is a surprise is that the social justice prime minister, who made so much of a stance on having meaningful consultation within his cabinet by including women and including people of color and including Indigenous people, showed that when those women and those people of color and those Indigenous people go against him, the old boys club will cloister and will boot them out. And I think that, while we probably expected that, the average Canadian and the average global, viewer of Canada did not.
Yeah, and I do think that's important, too, to point out that I think that's also a reason why the SNC-Lavalin stuff hasn't really stuck as the kind of big controversy that I think some of his opponents were hoping for. Because, like you said, it is a major, a foundational part of our political system. And I don't think anyone on, any part of the political spectrum in this country really believes that things would be different under the Conservative government, that they're going to be the ones that are going to get tough with massive corporations in Canada. It's kind of preposterous for them to be advancing that argument. So it's interesting because it is an element of corruption. It does puncture what people think of Justin Trudeau, but it's just such an integral part of our politics, this kind of public-private partnership, that it hasn't really stuck as this lasting thing, at least in my view. For precisely that reason, because people have a hard time believing that the Conservative Party would have treated that situation any differently.
Yeah, I mean, there are some other factors, much like with the United States, with the non-Bernie Sanders elements of the Democratic Party and the entirety of the Republican Party. They're all in the hands of capital, but not always the same segments of capital. So, you could make a case for saying that SNC-Lavalin has a specific connection to the Liberal Party, a historic one. They've made illegal donations to the Liberal Party. Back when their donations were legal, they were a steadfast kind of corporate ally to the Liberals. The key role they play in Quebec, which of course is much more important to Liberal success than it is to Conservative success, all really matters. And so much like the Conservative Party has certain elements of capital that it gravitates to. The Liberal Party has certain elements of capital that it gravitates to. So there are some differences here. Like the Conservative corruption scandal might have been with different corporations for different reasons, but it would have had the same underlying, objective and cause. And I think that's kind of important to know. SNC's Liberal connection is important. And as we know, Justin Trudeau basically did say, or at least his top staffers did say, that Justin Trudeau is the MP from Papineau, which is a Montreal riding, and we need to worry about re-election of our MPs in Quebec. So basically, let's be corrupt in favor of this Quebec corporation. And so that is important to know that maybe Andrew Scheer approaches his corruption differently. I mean, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, well then, no, that is an interesting difference between the two. But I think starting with Trudeau, if we're going to focus on the NDP, I think that's an interesting place to start. Just going back to 2015 and his election and the disappointing showing for the NDP in that election, because at least, I'm not that active in NDP politics or Canadian politics, or definitely much more so now than I was then. But my perspective at that time was that was really the NDP's election to lose. It looked like they were at the beginning of the election season. They were really in a great position to form the next government, which would have been really interesting. But it was a really disappointing campaign and result, obviously, for the NDP, as they kind of allowed Trudeau to appear as the more progressive candidate in that election. And that's, I think, why, or that played a big factor of why Trudeau won in the first place, is because he did seem more progressive and he was willing to kind of make more moves into that direction and appeal to the that sort of progressive sensibility. So just going back to that leadership election to today, I mean, from you following the NDP and doing the work that you do you think that they've done an adequate job of positioning themselves as a legitimate option to disrupt this never-ending kind of liberal conservative hegemony in this country?
Yeah, because I mean, going back to 2015, a lot of people said, well, the Liberals outflanked the NDP to the left, and I don't think that was necessarily true. But the rhetoric from the NDP was so cautious, and it was so, unclear that, the Star and many Liberal people were able to effectively say as such. And I think that Jagmeet Singh this time, even if he hasn't gone far enough on some issues, and we could talk about that, has unambiguously placed his party as the most progressive, most activist, most, diverse, most left-leaning, most, not anti-capitalist, but, questioning of the neoliberal consensus that's existed since I was a baby, basically, since the late 80s, early 1990s. And I think that, he's gone places where the Liberals will not go, like, national pharmacare, but not, a half-assed one, like a single-payer pharmacare, wealth taxes, capital gains tax increases, the freezing of student loan interest or the elimination of student loan interest. These are all things that the Liberals aren't considering. The full decriminalization of drugs. All of these things are unambiguously left policies that can't be seen as anything but. And so in relation to the alternatives, I think it's very clear that he's offering the most progressive platform, which, again, for maybe a low or medium information voter in 2015, they might be confused by that.
Yeah, I definitely agree that they've done a pretty decent job in this election campaign of putting out a kind of bold platform. And like you said, kind of it's not anti-capitalist, obviously, but they've at least been willing to kind of talk about these issues that they kind of shied away from in 2015. I guess for me, from my observations, the real missed opportunity has been the 3-4 years in between Trudeau's election and now. And it seems like they've had a hard time kind of getting their act together and pushing that kind of a message that entire time, and presenting themselves as a legitimate option to form the next government, and really, really hammering the Liberals on the promises that they've kind of backed away from, and hammering the Conservatives on the various things that they want to do that would be bad for kind of non-wealthy Canadians. Do you think there's an element of that is true as well? And if so, do you think that's partially because of the leadership election, or the fact that it kind of took them a while to transition from the Mulcair leadership to Jagmeet Singh? I think
Mulcair staying on for the year and a half or whatever it was not helpful. Mulcair maybe thought he could have stayed on. I think Mulcair probably should have resigned within a few weeks of that election. That's my view. Yeah. He should have bowed out. Who knows if that would have ultimately made a difference? Maybe somebody else runs and they're not as good a leader as Singh, or maybe Singh runs and he has more time. We don't know the alternative history, but I think Mulcair staying on, probably wasn't the best move. I also think that, the leadership election not starting right away, even after Mulcair was out, the leadership election not starting right away was probably a mistake. And I would disagree that the NDP hasn't been holding the Liberals and Conservatives to account, because there's been tons of instances of the NDP attacking the Liberals and Conservatives on their record, whether it's Charlie Angus, really being a one-man wrecking crew on the Liberals' lies to Indigenous people, or whether it's the NDP taking a clear stance against the Safe Third Country Agreement the only major party to do so, or whether it's the NDP, standing up for the charter rights of postal workers, which no other major party did, or whether it's Scott Duval and Hamilton challenging the Liberals who have, allowed corporations to use bankruptcy laws to steal pensions and benefits from retirees. On all these issues, the NDP has been doing the work. But I would agree on a broad sense that there wasn't the immediate embracement by Singh of what we're seeing now. And I do think that was an error. When Singh won his by-election in Burnaby earlier this year, I think that was the turning point. He started talking about the rigged game. He started reintroducing the policies he ran on during the leadership race, the wealth tax, the capital gains tax. They released the platform early. They released the kind of quote-unquote Canadian Green New Deal. We call it the New Deal for people, but effectively it's like the Canada's version of the Green New Deal. And all of that's been great, but I would agree that that it came too late. And I was writing right away when Singh became leader. I wrote something in Canadian Dimension, I think in 2017, early 2018, where I was like, Singh needs to bring out his tax plan, because at the time the Liberals were going through this big scandal where they were going to, close a tax loophole that was giving, highly paid professionals like doctors and their families ways out of taxes, and they were getting pushback from the right, and they were backing down. And I was like, this is Singh's opportunity to say that neither the Liberals nor the Conservatives will actually tax those who are well off to pay for the services we need, which is what he's saying now, and he's doing it effectively, but he could have done that sooner. And I think that was one of the biggest errors. It's that there's the narrative has been clear. The narrative window the NDP needs to follow has been clear, but they entered it a bit too late. It might not end up being too late, because I do see Singh getting some momentum, but why wait? And I think that was an issue that I and many other people on the left of the party were pointing out.
Yeah, because I think there's been plenty of activists and people on the left in Canada that have seen the Bernie Sanders campaign and seen the Jeremy Corbyn campaign in the UK, and have been saying, okay, this is what the NDP needs to do. There's the clear roadmap. And I guess the part of the frustration is that they haven't just wholeheartedly gone all the way and just adopting this kind of tactic. And I guess we've talked about some of the reasons for why that is, but do you think an element of it is just that, it seems to me that there is kind of a NDP brass, NDP leadership, that does seem reluctant to go all the way with that. And there's kind of an internal tension within the NDP of there, because certainly there's some great NDP MPs and activists within the party that want to do that, but it seems like something is kind of holding them back. Do you think that's an element of it, that there is kind of a leadership in the NDP that has been reluctant to go all the way with that?
There are some forces in the NDP that are obstinate and that sort of pine for the Laytonian era. And I have a great respect for Jack Layton, of course. And he was a fantastic politician and a great person, but he was kind of still this neoliberal era leader of the NDP, right? And I think the NDP found great success there, but I think in spite of the ideology, not because of it. And I think that what we're seeing from Singh, and I think from the fact that a lot of the new candidates, whether they're old new candidates like Sven Robinson, or whether they're new candidates like Leah Gazan or Matthew Green or Jessa McLean, there's so many. I'm not leaving anybody out, but that are really pushing the envelope, and the grassroots are pushing the envelope, and even the meme pages are pushing the envelope. And I think that it's becoming harder and harder to ignore. But this has been one of the issues. I think another factor is that Canada's Liberal Party is a rarity in the world. Canada's Liberal Party is a historical anomaly, and it makes the map of Canada's electoral politics harder to navigate than in other countries. In every other Anglosphere countries, the Liberal Party either disappeared or became a kind of rump third party, like the Lib Dems or what have you. And what happened was the Liberals and the Tories and Labour became big parties. Now, they might call themselves the Liberals in places like Australia, but effectively it's like the Tory-Labour split. Or in the United States, they've never had a broad Labour Party. Canada's the exception, where we have a social democratic, Labour-themed party, but our Liberal Party remained the natural governing party, quote unquote. And that makes it hard for the left because there's always a kind of quote-unquote center-left party, which is in reality a center-right party, that makes Canadians complacent. And I think that in some ways, the fact that Canada has not had the uber neoliberal effects to the same extent as we've seen in the United States and Britain means the left backlash, and I don't use that backlash in a connotative sense, but the left's ability to counterbalance that has been weakened. I mean, the financial crisis in Canada in 2008 wasn't as massive as it was in Britain and the United States, and so the left's response has been harder. I think that's certainly a factor. The United States literally has no socialized medicine at all. So it's easier for Bernie Sanders to take a radical tone, whereas Singh always has to counter with the fact that there's going to be a Liberal Party that consistently lies to voters and says that they're progressive too. And that makes Canadian politics very different. Even under the first Trudeau era, the whole narrative of the government, if you read their private documents, was to take NDP policies and make them effectively Liberal policies while still sounding like NDP policies, leaving the NDP in a tricky position. Do they, one, just keep their policies and sound like the Liberal Party, or two, take positions which may be outside the political bounds of respectability within, the current political debates. And this is not to excuse the party, because I think they could go further. Just a couple examples are, Singh should be pushing, I think, for the abolishment of student debt. Not just student interest, but we should push for free post-secondary education. Find some way of doing that, even if only partially at first, as to recognize that negotiations with the provinces will be long and difficult on that issue. And also, instead of just freezing telecom prices and capping them in certain cases, we should be pushing for a crown corporation. There are things that the party could do which I feel would be popular, but it's also the case that the existence of the Liberal Party makes the left politics in Canada more complicated than in Britain and the United States.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that last point. I mean, it's one thing to kind of criticize our telecom companies and start to kind of come up with policies to make that a little bit more palatable. But the idea of just having a nationalized telecom company or a crown corporation like you're talking about would force liberals and conservatives to then defend these big telecom conglomerates that no one actually likes, and would put them in a weird situation. But I do agree with that point that because we've been somewhat insulated by these kind of late capitalist crises that are affecting the US and affecting the UK, we haven't had the same level of brutal austerity. People don't have the same level of desperation. So it does make it more difficult for left parties to kind of put that message out there. But I also agree that shouldn't be a reason not to do it.
No, 100%. Yeah.
You also touched on something that I wanted to get into a little bit too, which is that now that the campaign has finally begun, and Jagmeet Singh is getting out there and getting a lot more media coverage, and they have kind of embraced this kind of rhetoric, even if it's maybe not as far as some might want it to go, like you or I, they are kind of naming the bad actors in capitalism and talking about inequality and things like this. And Singh is getting out there, and he's a likable and charismatic guy, and people are responding to that. And especially when you're in comparison to Scheer's just completely non-charisma, just lump of clay, and then Trudeau's kind of faux progressive marketing shtick, which is I think worn off for a lot of people. Singh all of a sudden is looking pretty genuine and looking like a possible alternative. But has that resulted in an actual polling increase? Because they were coming into this election at a kind of a severe deficit, looking like they might get wiped out. Has that been I haven't been paying that much attention to it. It doesn't seem like it's had as much of an impact as it needs to for them to really be where they need to be. But is there actually any momentum building for Jagmeet and the NDP to position themselves as an actual alternative in this election?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I certainly think that the coverage has been better. I think during elections, whether it's a legal thing or whether it's just the media has more resources allocated, the NDP is actually getting good coverage. I mean, this is not, I hate sounding conspiratorial, but I do feel that in the run up to the election, the NDP only got coverage when it was bad. And sometimes those stories were were like fair questions, like, oh, the NDP's lagging behind in fundraising, and it's like, that's an issue. And I mean, fair enough. Like, sometimes it's blown out of proportion, but like, there's not a lie there necessarily. But then it's like, okay, Singh's actually getting coverage now. His press events are getting coverage now. They're getting shown on, media's like showing them on the TV. They're showing them on YouTube. They're showing them on Facebook more consistently now. And I don't think it's a surprise that Canadians, the more they see him, the more they like him. And you're right to note that the top line polls haven't shifted much, upwards or downwards for the NDP, although there is a couple exceptions. The polling firms that had the NDP at about 7 or 8, those like doomsday polls, there was only a couple of them. Both of those pollsters had the NDP up 30 or 40% from those numbers. So like those polls have shown at least that there's a big jump. Still not good numbers, but the doomsday polls seem to have disappeared. Many of the other polls, I would say the average of the NDP is in and around 14%, which isn't too far from where Jack Layton was in 2011, this far out from the election. For perspective, Layton was polling, in and around 14 to 16%. Some polls even a little bit lower. But what is showing momentum for Singh is his personal numbers. Nanos has noted, for instance, that especially amongst young people, he's absolutely skyrocketed. He's up more than 10% in like a couple weeks in terms of support for people 18 to 29. And of course, we know there's a narrative that young people don't vote, blah, 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 blah. But I think that is something important to see, that young people are leaving Trudeau, whether it's due to the climate change issue or whether it's due to the blackface issue or whether it's due to the fact that they now see a progressive alternative that they like. He's gaining there. And Angus Reid, for instance, did a poll on the favorable and unfavorable ratings of all the party leaders, and what they found is that only Singh right now is positive. Only Singh has a higher favorable than unfavorable, although he's pretty close to even. But Singh is also the only one that, since the start of the election, has positive momentum. Everyone else is down, whereas Singh is quite a bit up, including Elizabeth May is down since the election, at least according to Angus Reid, indicating that he's the only one that, as Canadians see more and more of, they actually like more and more. And one, I guess, double-edged sword is that it's still the case that some people don't know who he is. He's got relatively high, I don't know, I don't have an opinion on him numbers as compared to, say, Trudeau and Scheer. And so, that does show that there's a chance that as more and more people see him, and we have the two, official debates next week, right? We have the official French and official English language debates next week on the 7th and the 10th, I believe. And those will be, I think, crucial in introducing these people to Canadians, because those will probably be the debates that are watched most. And I think that's his opportunity. So in a sense, the key polling numbers haven't moved. They haven't moved down. They have been moving upwards at least a little bit. But where there has been movement is with Singh himself. And I think that can often be a precursor to the party moving.
And maybe he's going to end up getting a Rihanna bump from the now very, very crucial and important Rihanna Instagram follow that he picked up.
I mean, that's a big deal. Like, I mean, look, it's funny, and it's like a joke, and like it's gotten a lot of coverage from like the entertainment press and even some mainstream. But I mean, like, those things matter, and like Rihanna is like extremely influential. Like, she got 76 million followers. She's, one of the world's biggest musicians. She's kind of renowned as a relative trailblazer amongst black female entrepreneurs. Like her following matters. And again, especially if it's like, well, Singh's going to need young people to come out for him. These little moments, I think, speak to people. Like, I mean, I don't think it's it's going to actually cause a bump or anything, but I think it's more of an indicator of success than a predictor of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, but it just shows that I think that the more people are seeing him, he is a likable, charismatic guy, and I think he's genuine in a lot of the ways that Trudeau isn't. And that people are picking up on that, whether it's Rihanna or anyone else.
Or TV offered their debate, the French language debate, their panel afterwards. Basically all of the panelists agreed that there's one thing about Jagmeet Singh was he was authentic, put his heart on the table, he was who he was, and whether you like him or not, because some people are not going to like him, I think that you're getting authenticity. Like, look, I mean, like, there's the whole Andrew Scheer, was he an insurance broker? Is he an American? Like, whether or not you think these issues matter, it's like, well, like, what is he not telling the truth about? And then Justin Trudeau, literally, I haven't for like we could spend a whole episode. And I don't think we should, but we could spend a whole episode talking about the blackface issue and how like it's a travesty this country has gotten over that. But we have to remember that Justin Trudeau lied about the number of times he did it. He said on the plane he did it twice. We know he did it at least 3 times. And now he won't say how many times he's done it or the last time he's done it. So he's been asked, are there more than these 3? And he hasn't answered. And now he said, is 2001 the latest incident? And unless I'm missing something, I haven't seen them confirm or deny that 2001 is the last. So when did he do it as an MP? Did he do it as prime minister? Like, we don't even know. And it's like, Singh has none of this. Singh has none of these like scandals. Like, Singh's issues are like, he should be bolder, or Singh's issues are like, should he be better learning the lessons from Corbyn and Sanders? But Singh's issues aren't like, lied about professional qualifications or did something that dehumanizes millions of Canadians.
Yeah, and I think the blackface thing has been really important too, because another thing that's important, especially to young Canadians and young people everywhere, is the issues of social justice and racial justice. And whereas, Trudeau has spent time talking about these things, obviously when it regards to that scandal or the way that he's kind of backed down on his very passionate words about Indigenous reconciliation as he like buys oil pipelines and ignores Indigenous activism that are trying to block these pipelines. But then when Singh talks about these issues, it's not phony. And he obviously, as a person of color, the first person of color to lead a federal party in this country, he is able to speak about these things really passionately and eloquently and genuinely. And that's also something that people have responded really positively to, especially young people.
Yeah, I mean, and I think like, and there's been a lot of discussion about these moments, like where Singh and also his brother Guritan, who's an Ontario MPP for the NDP, have kind of been face down either with hecklers or people, coming up to them and saying, well, if you took your turban off, you'd look more Canadian. And there's been a lot of discussion about how Singh has handled that really well. And then also some really good discussion about how, like, he's sort of trapped in those moments because white respectability demands that he handle it a very particular way. There's been a lot of great discussions, but I think the general point of view is that in those moments, those are like character moments. And I think that in those moments, Singh has been showing people that, like, this is a guy of character. And this is a guy that, in these candid moments responds in a certain way that a lot of people feel is good. Now, whether or not that's fair, because again, like, there's been a lot of arguments that a man of color can't respond to hate with anything else other than a very kind of like careful, managed response, lest he be deemed aggressive or what have you. The fact is that I think people see these things and react positively to them. And that clip, just on the one instance of it being shared by a CBC journalist, the one where he's at the market in Montreal and the guy comes up to him and says, well, when in Rome, be like Romans. And he said, well, when you're in Canada, you can do what you like. That's been seen well over 1 million times now, which is massive for anything Canadian politics related. And I think this is one of the reasons why he's getting attention beyond Canada. But I think it's also another reason why he's getting, I think, more eyeballs on him just generally.
Yeah, no, that's true. And that was a really impressive response, although I kind of end up wondering, and maybe my approach would not be the best way, but it's like, I wonder how he's able to keep his composure in those kind of circumstances, because you can tell it just happens all the time. And that, like, I don't know how it would help his electoral prospects. It probably wouldn't, but I would like to see a bit more anger from him in those situations. And I think that's it could be even another criticism too of Singh, is that as he has this kind of aura of kindness and authenticity, but I think also what brings people into the Bernie Sanders coalition also is that he's able to express anger and he's able to like show frustration at the economic system. And I think I don't know if it would be a good strategy or not, but I personally would like to see a little bit more of that from Jagmeet, whether it's confronting these racist dickheads and that are hassling him about his religious headwear, or talking about these economic problems. But again, I'm not a political advisor, and maybe for that reason is probably the best for the best.
Well, I mean, I think you're right, though, to a certain point. I mean, one of the things I've noted for a long time, and I noted this back in when Bernie, I think I noted this during the first Bernie run, like when he ran against Clinton for the first nomination. And I said that, like, what Bernie Sanders is teaching Canada right now, and this was, I think, in the context of Mulcair he either was, just before the election or just after. Mulcair was like, we're not going to raise taxes on the rich. Like, he was, like, trying to curry favor with the CFIB, which was disgusting.
He was talking about balancing the budget as well.
Yeah, and balancing the budget doesn't actually bother me. If you're like, look, we're going to tax the rich at 95% and we're never going to run a deficit again in our lives, I don't mind balanced budget rhetoric. I really don't. But, like, I understand the politics of it, which is that, like, it bleeds so easily into austerity. You know what I mean? Like, I get it. But, like, all of that right, like that desire to be seen as safe for capital just, like, infuriated me, because the NDP, no matter how moderate it runs, always, like, capital will always freak out at the possibility of an NDP government. I mean, Rachel Notley's government was not a left-wing NDP government, and it wasn't trying to be one either. But it's still, like, I don't know if you remember, like, the week before she won, the titans of industry and like even like university heads came together to warn the dangers of an NDP government, and it didn't work. But it showed that, like, they never do that when the Liberals are about to win. Like, capital maybe likes the Tories more on certain issues, but, like, they're perfectly content with a Liberal government. And it's like, the NDP will always be hated. They'll always be seen as socialist by their enemies. So just be socialist. And I think that what Bernie Sanders did extremely well was embraced class conflict. Basically said, look, there is class conflict. It's real. The working people didn't start it, but they have to engage in it to protect their interests, to protect their livelihoods, to build a better life for their family. And Singh has started doing that, but this goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is that for much of his early tenure, we didn't see that enough. And it's been in recent months where he's been like, the rigged game, we don't have Medicare, we don't have pharmacare and dental care, not because it's too expensive or too complicated, but because pharmaceutical companies and dental lobbies don't want you to have these things. We need to tax the rich more. Justin Trudeau is in it for Trump and not in it for working Canadians. And that kind of, like, hard-nosed rhetoric is coming, but maybe not to the extent of Bernie. And that could be a matter of style. It could be a matter of, again, the fact that, white supremacist politics dictate that the way a person of color can respond to things are more restrained in a way. Bernie Sanders, although othered as a Jewish person, is a white man, and I think can respond differently to certain issues in a way that a non-white politician could. All of these factors matter, but I do think that Singh should have jumped in quicker and harder on class conflict, although we're seeing a bit of it now.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess what the hope is that if this, depending on the results of this coming election, hopefully the lesson learned by the NDP is that they need to fully embrace that even more so than they have, and not the other way around. But I guess that also depends on how things go in this election. But you touched on, you mentioned the incident in Montreal's Atwater Market, which has, I think, reminded a lot of people of some of the issues with racism that we have in Canada broadly, but also in this province, and Islamophobia. And obviously Singh's not Muslim, but because certain racist constituencies don't really know what the difference is, he's kind of being affected by that. And so he's actually gotten some criticism for some of his answers about Bill 21 in Quebec, which, if you're not familiar, is the religious symbols act here in Quebec, which is banning, things like the hijab for public workers, which has been obviously very controversial because it's extremely racist. But when Singh was asked about this, he kind of wasn't really able to commit to, if he was prime minister, kind of federally pushing back on this. And I think, from my perspective, some of this has been kind of undeserved. Partially because, the reason we have Bill 21 in Quebec is because it's popular and a lot of people agree with it. And, what that says about Quebec, that, people can decide for themselves. But I think Singh's answer on this actually is not as bad as some people have made it out to be, in that the way that we need to push back on this is not just by the prime minister putting his foot down and saying, no, we're not going to have this, but by grassroots organizing and from people from the bottom up, educating people about why this is wrong and why it's racist, and building a movement on the grassroots to push back against racist laws like this. What was your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I largely agree with your perspective. And I think it's important to note that, and again, this isn't everything, but Singh has been very vocal in criticizing the legislation and calling it discrimination. And so whether or not you're happy with the official response, he has been clear in his personal condemnation. Justin Trudeau has also offered that, but I don't think as strongly and as consistently. Another fact, my view is that it's a very tricky situation because, as you note, this is popular within Quebec. A majority of Quebecers, a rather large majority of Quebecers support it. And until recently, even Quebec's left party, which is to the left of the NDP, had a very, I think, nebulous position on the rights of religious minorities. Yeah. And I think Quebec Solidaire has moved in the right direction. And I think that's a sign, and given the fact that there is, I think, increasingly more overlap between NDPers and Quebec Solidaire people, at least on the grassroots, that it is probably a better solution on the medium and long term to work to change the minds of Quebecers. I think there's a risk in a federal challenge, even if successful, making more than it is now Islamophobia and quote unquote secularism, because it's a not just an issue of racism and xenophobia, but an issue of Quebec's rights within Confederation. And if you challenge the legislation in that sense, are you in effect emboldening the racist position as the defense of Quebec, right? And I mean, there are some people in Quebec who oppose the law, but oppose the federal government opposing it, right? And so it's a very tricky situation, and that's not necessarily an excuse. You might still think a challenge is needed, but I do think that, we should, probably the more correct way to see a challenge is, a traditional charter challenge, which is to see people who are affected, challenge the law based on, I think, Section 7 and Section 15, and Section 15 probably most likely, of the charter, which is the equality section, basically arguing that this violates their charter rights, and Quebec might go ahead and use the notwithstanding clause. At that point, I do think a legal challenge should be considered. Singh hasn't closed the door on a legal challenge, but he hasn't committed to one either, and maybe that's the right position. But again, this is a tricky one for me to comment on because I'm not a Quebecois. I've never lived in Quebec, nor am I a Quebecois person, and nor am I.
I live in Quebec, and I barely understand Quebec politics at all. So,
and nor am I a person of color or a religious minority who would be affected by this legislation. And so, all of those things considered, I mean, I don't know if I want to say too much more, but I don't think this is quite the issue it's made out to be. I know Tom Mulcair said something about it, but even Tom Mulcair, from some people's perspective, was less clear than he could have been in 2015 on the niqab issue. I do think he did take a hit for taking a bold stand, but he was also less clear than maybe he's criticizing Singh for being.
I guess Quebec is another. I mean, again, I know you're not a totally expert in Quebec politics, but I know it has been tricky for the NDP to gain a foothold here. What do you see as being their strategy in this election to try and change that? And it is so tricky because of these kinds of voting constituencies that are out there in this province that see a guy like Jagmeet Singh leading the party and are instantly turned off from that. And again, that's disappointing and frustrating to see that happen, but that is like an electoral issue that they have to kind of solve. And Layton was able to do it in the Orange Wave election in Quebec, partially by rallying people against the Conservative government and people in Quebec kind of agreeing that the NDP was the best option to unseat the Conservatives, which obviously didn't end up working out. But what do you see as the challenges for the NDP in Quebec in this election? And do you think there's any hope that they can gain the same kind of a foothold that they had here for briefly? And again, I know you're not an expert in Quebec politics, so you don't need to get into the in-depth of it. Just as someone that pays attention to what the NDP strategy is, I was just wondering what your perspective was on that.
I mean, Quebec politics has been really tricky. I mean, Quebec is an ideologically eclectic place. I mean, in 2015, the Bloc Québécois attacked the NDP in part for its support of pipelines, at least as far as the Alberta NDP goes. And I don't know if you remember that ad where they had a pipeline that transformed into a niqab. And it was basically like the NDP is going to funnel in dirty oil and Muslims. And it was like this, on the one hand, it's like this eco, progressive thing combined with Islamophobia. And it made it very tricky for the NDP. And I think the NDP, especially when they compete with the Bloc, is always at a disadvantage, and every party's at a disadvantage because the Bloc only has to consider what is popular in Quebec because they don't run anywhere else. The NDP and the Liberals and the Conservatives, on the other hand, want to win seats in Quebec, but then often have to worry about moments where Quebec disagrees with their key constituencies in other parts of the country. So Trudeau, for instance, is a pipeline champion. He's fought harder for a pipeline than even Stephen Harper did, right? Like Trudeau, more than any other prime minister, like he bought the pipeline to build it. But yet in Quebec, he knows instinctively that such projects are unpopular. So you basically got to say different things in different provinces. And on the issue of race and religion, it's a similar factor. I think Singh's strategy is to let people know that they have a strong core of MPs that they know well. And, those MPs have served Quebec in some cases now for 7 or 8 years or so. And I think these are people well. Ruth Ellen Brosseau, Alexandre Boulerice, Guy Caron, on and on and on. So, you can trust them. And you should learn more about Jagmeet Singh. He's shown people that he can take the turban off, that it's not some grand mystery. He's talked about, I think, specifically that he shares Quebecers' values. He shares their values on women's rights. He shares their values on ecological issues. He shares their values on taxing the rich. He shares their values on good social programs. And I think that's the strategy. That it's like, look, you think my religion makes me different from you, but in reality, that's just a part of me. What makes me like Quebecers is my commitment to progressive values. And so, let's build a better Canada together despite our differences, right? And I don't know if that's going to work, but I think that's his effort. And I mean, more than that, I can't make predictions. I mean, it does look like right now with the polling that because of the rise again of the Bloc, that there will probably be a decline in seats for the NDP unless Singh sees a big bump in Quebec. But I think he's doing a decent job at introducing himself to a province that didn't really know much about him, and that what they did know about him was probably crafted more by prejudice than by actual factual knowledge about him.
It seems like he surprised a lot of people with his performance in the French language debate as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, there was a poll done, I think it was by Legier, don't quote me on that, but I did see something on Twitter before the debate asking people, who did you think would win the debate? And Singh was last. He was below 10%. So not a lot of people had high expectations. Maybe they thought his French wasn't good, when in reality, his French is not a whole lot worse than Trudeau's. It's similar to his in quality, I would say. And it's a heck of a lot better than Scheer's French. But also, I think that there was low expectations. And, Justin Trudeau benefited from low expectations in 2015 in those early debates. People didn't expect a lot from him. And so I think Jagmeet Singh had some low expectations. And from what I've seen, at least, a lot of people thought he did really well. A lot of the pundits in Quebec thought he did really well. I've seen some people suggest that the Bloc leader won the debate, but I've seen no one suggest that Jagmeet Singh had a bad debate. Whereas there's a near universal consensus that it was a bad 2 hours for Andrew Scheer, and that Justin Trudeau at times was invisible, given the fact that he was prime minister. That's kind of inexcusable.
Yeah. And I guess that's pretty much covers everything that I wanted to talk about. And I guess, talking about the federal election in a general sense, I've always been kind of operating under the assumption that the Conservatives were going to form the next government. And I guess the only thing that gives me hope is how uncharismatic and bad Scheer has been on this campaign, both in that debate and elsewhere. And I'm always a person, I've been critical of the NDP, but I'm someone that I think wants the NDP to do well. And even though I don't think maybe they've gone quite far enough in some areas, I think we have seen a lot of encouraging stuff from them in this campaign. And even though I think it's probably unlikely that they'll form the next government, I think, it's been encouraging. And hopefully after this election, the lesson they're going to have learned is that we need to lean even harder into some of this stuff. And Jagmeet's shown that he can be a credible leader that people kind of believe in and inspires them. And if he can really embrace this kind of rhetoric that he's started to use, that could lead to even better things for the NDP in the future. So that's kind of what I'm hoping comes out of this federal election.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the polls right now, they're really interesting. First past the post is like objectively the worst way to elect people. Like, I don't know if you've ever done an electoral reform episode, but it's just the worst, right? Like, it doesn't represent
I've talked a lot about how. Yeah. I've talked a lot about how Trudeau. That was one of the only things that made me want to believe that he could be an okay prime minister, is the fact that he was so adamant that he was going to change that system, because I hate first past the post so much, and I hate strategic voting. So that's one of the main things of why I detest Trudeau, is because he backed down on that. That was one of his most central campaign promises.
Yeah, he said it like 1,800 times. But the point is that
couldn't have been more clear.
Yeah, if you look at the polls as they are right now, and different pollsters have it different, and different aggregators, even based on how they weigh polls, have it different. But I would say the consensus is that the Conservatives are winning in popular vote, but because their vote is overwhelmingly clustered in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, they're actually losing the seat count. And that the most likely option right now is the Conservatives winning the most votes, but the Liberals winning a plurality, but not a majority of seats. Although some polls suggest that the Liberals could win a majority with like 34% of the vote. Basically, a third of the votes could give them absolute power, because the Conservative vote is so poorly distributed, because the Liberals are very strong in Ontario, at least on some polls, because of Doug Ford, a backlash to Ford. Even though, as we know, the backlash to Ford, I think, should be benefiting the NDP, because if we recall, Kathleen Wynne in the final days of that election essentially backed Ford by attacking the NDP. But that's another story. The point is that a minority government does look reasonably likely, especially as it does look like, Trudeau has been slipping at least a little bit, both in his own numbers and in the polling. And so I think that's crucial, because it's likely the NDP will hold the balance of power. And, while that might be in the context of seats being lost, that the total might fall, I think that there's a chance for Jagmeet Singh to build a strong, if smaller caucus even, that can go forward and have a real element of power in the following government and build credibility going forward. Again, I'm not ruling anything out, because of course, as we know, Jack Layton was again polling similarly to where Singh is now. So we don't know what will happen, but I don't think it's out of the realm of even a small possibility or a large possibility that Singh could gain 4 or 5 or 6 more points in the next couple weeks and really put himself in the ability to set up a strong minority, caucus. And I think that's really crucial, especially in the context, again, that there are a ton of young and progressive candidates running in some very winnable ridings that will build, I think, a good progressive caucus around Singh.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, the kind of main French and English debates are coming up, and he's done I think a pretty admirable job in the first few debates, and these are more people are going to be paying attention to these, and maybe that could have a big impact on what their result is over the next couple of weeks. But in any case, Christo, I really appreciate you coming onto the program to talk to me about all this stuff. Before we get going here, do you just want to plug, whatever you have out there that you'd like people to check out?
Yeah, for sure. You can follow me on Twitter. It's just at Christo Avalis, ChristoAivalis. It's just all one word. Also check out my YouTube channel, where I talk about a lot of the things we talked about today. Again, it's just my name with a space in the middle this time. So do check me out there. I also have a Facebook page, but Twitter and YouTube are where I'm probably most active.
Yeah, fuck Facebook. Okay, Christo, well, thanks again. I appreciate you coming on. I enjoyed talking to you about this stuff, and take care. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks again.
That was Christo Avalis, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that. I really appreciated him coming on the program and speaking to me about all this stuff. Make sure you follow him on Twitter and check out his YouTube channel as well. Really good stuff.